It was just another Monday morning at Brookdale Elementary, a place where the hallways smelled faintly of crayons, peanut butter sandwiches, and the unmistakable buzz of childhood energy. Teachers prepped their whiteboards, backpacks slammed into cubbies, and kids shared weekend stories like stockbrokers trading hot tips. Everything seemed routine until something happened that would shake the class to its core. And it all started with one boy, one empty seat, and one decision that no one saw coming. What happened next would not only test the courage of a teacher but challenge an entire classroom's understanding of kindness, dignity, and what it really means to be human. If you think this is just another school story, think again, because what this teacher did in the face of rejection has left parents, educators, and even strangers speechless. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why. Now, before we dive deeper, let me ask you something straight up. Have you ever witnessed a moment so unfair, so uncomfortable, that it made your stomach twist, but you weren't sure whether to speak up or stay silent? If you have, you already know the power of small moments. If you haven't, this story might change how you see them forever. I promise you this isn't just about one boy or one mistake. It's about something much bigger, something that's happening every day in classrooms, parks, restaurants, and homes all across America. That's why this story isn't just worth watching, it needs to be watched. And if you stay with me until the end, you'll see the twist that left an entire school in tears for all the right reasons. Because here's the truth. Every story you hear today might be polished and picture-perfect, but the real ones, the ones that matter, are raw, emotional, and sometimes a little uncomfortable. But that's where the magic is. That's where people grow. That's where heroes are made. And that's why you clicked on this video. Whether you're a parent, a teacher, a student, or just someone trying to make sense of the world, there's something in this story meant just for you. So don't click away. Don't scroll past. You've already invested these few seconds, so lean in, because the answer to why this boy refused to sit next to a classmate with special needs isn't what you think. And what the teacher did in response. It's being called one of the most brilliant teaching moments caught in recent memory. Let's take it back to the start. The classroom was already buzzing as the students filed in. Third grade, full of energy, hormones not quite settled, and personalities as loud as they were unique. Miss Jenkins, the teacher, had been doing this for 14 years. She was the kind of teacher that didn't just know your name. She knew if your parents were going through a divorce, if your goldfish had died last weekend, or if you secretly loved reading but were afraid to say so. She didn't teach from the textbook, she taught from the heart. But that morning, as she looked across the room, she noticed something wasn't right. There was an extra desk placed near the window, an intentional move. That desk was for Lucas, a quiet, sweet kid with special needs who was being integrated into a general classroom for the first time. Lucas was different. He had a developmental delay that affected how he spoke, moved, and sometimes reacted to loud noises or fast changes. He wore headphones to block out overstimulation, flapped his hands when excited, and sometimes needed help understanding instructions. But he also loved dinosaurs, could name every planet in the solar system, and smiled in a way that made you feel like you mattered. This was supposed to be his first day in a normal classroom. His parents had been anxious for weeks, and Miss Jenkins had worked hard to prepare the students, gently explaining that not all brains work the same and that inclusion meant more than just being in the same room. But when Lucas walked in, eyes wide, backpack bouncing, holding tightly to the teacher aide's hand, there was a moment. A moment so sharp, it cut the air in half. Kids stopped talking. Some whispered. Some giggled. And then, as Miss Jenkins asked the students to find their assigned seats, a boy named Jacob stood frozen. His name tag was next to Lucas's. Jacob, popular, confident, known for being a bit of a class clown, looked at the desk, then at Lucas, then back at Miss Jenkins. And then he said something no one expected. Something loud enough for half the class to hear. "I'm not sitting next to him." The silence that followed was brutal. Heads turned. Eyes darted. A few kids snickered, unsure if they were allowed to laugh. Lucas didn't seem to understand the words, but he could feel the shift. His body stiffened. The teacher aide gently squeezed his hand, trying to mask the sudden change in the room's temperature. Miss Jenkins didn't yell. She didn't scold. She didn't call the principal. What she did next, though, would become a lesson not only for Jacob, but for every student in that room, and eventually for thousands of parents, teachers, and strangers online who would hear about it later. But before I tell you what happened next, before I reveal the moment that had parents crying and teachers writing thank you letters, I need you to sit with that scene for a second. Because this isn't just about one kid being rude. It's about something we all face every day. Fear of the unknown, judgment, peer pressure, the quiet, invisible moments where we're tested not by the big things, but by the subtle choices that define our character. And in that moment, Jacob wasn't the villain. He was just a mirror. A mirror reflecting how society often teaches kids to react to what they don't understand. So, here's the real question. What do you do when someone different enters your world? Maybe it's the kid with a stutter, the cashier with Down syndrome, the classmate in a wheelchair, the guy at the gym who talks to himself. Do you lean in or lean away? Do you stay silent or speak up? That's what makes this story so powerful. Because what happened next wasn't about punishment, it was about transformation. A transformation so clever, so heartwarming, and so deeply human that even hardened cynics were moved. And as you keep watching, you'll find out how Miss Jenkins didn't just handle the situation, she turned it into a moment of pure genius. Now, I know we're all used to viral videos where someone gets owned or shut down in dramatic fashion, right? Maybe a customer freaks out and someone claps back. Or a Karen gets what's coming. But this isn't that kind of story. This is about quiet power. About the way one person's empathy can ripple through an entire room like a stone dropped in still water. It's about a teacher who didn't just stop bad behavior. She changed the story. So, why did Jacob refuse to sit next to Lucas? Was it fear? Peer pressure? Something he heard at home? And what exactly did Miss Jenkins do that had kids lining up after class to hug her? What made one parent later say, "I wish every teacher in America would hear this story"? That's what you're going to find out. And trust me, it's not what you think. Because just when you think the story is about to go one way, it takes a turn. And just when you think the lesson has been learned, there's a twist that will hit you like a freight train of perspective. This isn't just a video, it's an invitation. An invitation to see the world a little differently, to feel a little deeper, to remember that the most powerful lessons don't come from textbooks, they come from real moments, real people, and the courage to do what's right even when no one's watching. So stay with me. Because what Miss Jenkins did next didn't just change one boy, it inspired an entire school. And what happened the very next morning, well, let's just say no one saw it coming. Cliffhanger ending for part 1. As the room sat frozen, all eyes on Jacob, waiting to see if he'd sit down or double down, Miss Jenkins calmly walked to her desk, picked up a single sheet of paper, and began writing something. She didn't look angry. She didn't raise her voice. But whatever she was writing, whatever plan was silently unfolding, would set off a chain reaction that would flip the entire classroom upside down. And when she finally turned the paper over for the class to see, everything changed. What was on that paper? Keep watching. The answer is coming. And it's more powerful than you can imagine. Miss Jenkins didn't speak right away. She finished writing on the paper in a slow, methodical manner, as though she were crafting something more than words, something symbolic, intentional, almost strategic. The classroom watched her every move, the air tight with tension, every breath held in quiet anticipation. She then turned the paper around and placed it on the whiteboard easel at the front of the room. No one could read it from their seats. And still, she said nothing. Instead, she calmly picked up a stack of index cards and began walking desk to desk, handing one to each student without a word. Even Jacob received one. And then, still without breaking her calm demeanor, she finally addressed the class, not with scolding or sarcasm, but with something far more unsettling, a challenge. "I want each of you," she said, "to write down the one thing that makes you feel different from everyone else. The thing that makes you feel like you don't quite belong." Her voice was gentle, almost soothing, but the silence it left in its wake was deafening. No names. Just honesty. At first, no one moved. A few students exchanged confused glances, unsure if this was a trick or some kind of punishment in disguise. But eventually, pencils began scratching the surface of the cards. And in those few minutes, a strange sort of vulnerability washed over the room, because it didn't matter how popular you were or how invisible you felt. Everyone had something. Even Jacob. His hand hovered above the card for a long moment before he finally wrote something down, his expression unreadable. When the cards were collected and shuffled, Miss Jenkins began reading them aloud, one by one. I get nervous every time I have to read out loud. My parents are getting divorced, and I don't know who I'll live with. I hate how I look in pictures. I don't understand math, and it makes me feel stupid. I get bullied at recess, but I pretend it doesn't bother me. The room was still. Some kids looked down. Others blinked faster than usual, fighting back something deeper. Jacob's mouth was tight, his eyes locked on the front of the room. Lucas, meanwhile, looked confused, unsure why the mood had shifted again but instinctively knowing something important was happening. This was where the emotional wires began to cross. Because for Jacob, this wasn't just about sitting next to someone different. That seat had become something symbolic, an amplifier for whatever he was dealing with outside of school. Something he hadn't told anyone about. See, what no one in class knew was that Jacob had recently started visiting his dad on weekends. His dad who had moved out 2 months ago, after a fight that ended with broken glass and police lights outside their house. And while the divorce wasn't public knowledge, the scars were starting to show. Jacob had changed. He had become more reactive, more guarded, more desperate to feel like he was in control of something, anything. And that's the problem with control. Sometimes, we exercise it not where it's needed, but where it's convenient. In that moment, sitting next to someone he didn't understand felt like one more thing he couldn't manage. So he pushed back. Hard. But Miss Jenkins? She had seen that kind of behavior before. She'd taught enough kids to recognize when a refusal wasn't really about what was in front of them, but about everything behind them. That's why she didn't yell. That's why she didn't embarrass Jacob. She wanted the class to see something deeper. To understand that we're all carrying things no one else can see, and that sometimes those things come out sideways. She began unfolding that lesson not through lectures or punishments, but through empathy and subtle, strategic exposure. And as she read those anonymous cards aloud, the classroom began to transform, not in noise, but in awareness. Kids started looking at each other differently, as if for the first time, they were seeing more than just surface. Still, there was something lingering beneath the surface, something that didn't quite sit right. Some students were starting to wonder why Jacob's reaction had been so intense. It wasn't just a passing comment, it was firm, cold, almost rehearsed. And the way he kept glancing at the window where Lucas sat, almost nervously, gave rise to a quiet theory. Had something happened between them before today? Had Jacob heard something at home that shaped his reaction? The class didn't know it, but a quiet red thread was being woven through the day, connecting bits and pieces that didn't make sense yet, but would soon. And then there was Emma, the quiet girl in the back who always sat near the bookshelf and doodled in the margins of her worksheets. She'd been watching Jacob closely all morning, and she knew something the others didn't. A week before, during recess, Emma had seen Jacob and his friends laughing about something near the monkey bars. Lucas had been on the swings, being pushed gently by a teacher aide. And Jacob's group had been watching him, laughing, imitating the way he flapped his hands, making noises. Emma had turned away, unsure what to do, unsure if saying something would only make things worse. Now, sitting in class and watching Jacob squirm under Miss Jenkins' gentle spotlight, she was beginning to piece things together. This wasn't a one-time reaction. It had history. There was a backstory here, one no one else had acknowledged yet. But that wasn't the only thread. Because Miss Jenkins herself had a reason this moment mattered more than most would guess. 2 years ago, her own nephew had been diagnosed with a neurodevelopmental disorder. She had watched her sister cry over IEP meetings and watched her nephew get excluded from birthday parties, misunderstood by coaches, and side-eyed in grocery stores. So this moment in her classroom wasn't just professional, it was personal. When she looked at Lucas, she saw more than a student. She saw every child who had ever been made to feel like an outsider in a world that couldn't be bothered to slow down and understand. But there was still a piece missing. Why, with all this background, had Jacob reacted so strongly today of all days? Was it just the seating chart? Or was something else going on beneath the surface? The next clue came in the form of a text message. During lunch, as the kids were filing into the cafeteria, Jacob's phone buzzed in his pocket. He wasn't supposed to have it on, but he peeked at the screen anyway. One message. From his dad. Don't let them stick you with those kids. You're better than that. Just that. No context. No greeting. Just those words, heavy and raw. Jacob's face flushed as he locked the screen. That text, sent without warning, explained more than anything he could have said aloud. Because kids aren't born knowing hate or fear, they're taught it. Sometimes overtly, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in the silence between the lines. And in that message, Jacob had received more than advice. He'd received permission. Permission to reject, to judge, to draw a line between us and them. And now, that permission was unraveling in front of an entire classroom, one card, one sentence, one pair of eyes at a time. But even as the truth began to creep in, Miss Jenkins wasn't finished. She knew she had to push a little further, but gently. She still hadn't revealed what was written on the paper she'd posted at the front of the room. It had sat there all morning like a loaded question. And just before the bell rang for recess, she finally walked to the easel, turned it around, and let the words face the class. You never know the battle someone else is fighting. Just 7 words. But in that room, in that moment, it was as if the walls themselves leaned in to listen. The kids stared. Some squinted. Others nodded. Jacob didn't move. His jaw was tight again, but something in his eyes had shifted. Miss Jenkins let the silence speak, didn't add to it, didn't lecture. She just let the words breathe. And as the students filed out for recess, she watched them carefully, noting every glance, every lingering look between Jacob and Lucas. The story wasn't over. Far from it. Because what happened the next morning, the way the entire class responded to something no one saw coming, would change not just Jacob and Lucas, but the entire school. And if you think you know how this ends, trust me, you don't. The next morning, the air in the classroom felt different. Heavy, almost charged, like the calm before a storm that no one could quite see yet but could feel deep in their chest. Jacob arrived earlier than usual, eyes darting across the room like he was searching for something or someone. Lucas wasn't there yet. Neither was Miss Jenkins. A couple of kids glanced at Jacob as he sat down, and for once, no one rushed to join him. The murmurs were quieter today, but they were still there, trailing behind him like shadows. Something had shifted. The message on the board from the day before, "You never know the battle someone else is fighting," had done more than just hang in the air. It had wedged itself into people's minds, reshaping how they looked at each other, how they looked at him. But just when it seemed like things might settle, like maybe this lesson would land softly, something strange happened. Miss Jenkins came into class a few minutes late, carrying her usual tote bag, a coffee, and a tight expression. Without saying a word, she walked directly to the easel and looked at the board, but the message was gone. Erased.
Clean.
Like it had never been there. She froze. Just for a second. Her eyes scanned the room quickly, landing on Jacob for the briefest moment before moving on. "Did anyone touch the board?" she asked, her voice unusually clipped. No one answered. A few heads shook, a few shoulders shrugged. But something wasn't right. That message had stayed there after the bell yesterday, and everyone had seen her leave it behind. But now, gone. Vanished without a trace. That message wasn't just words. It had been a moment, a signal. And now it had been scrubbed away. During silent reading time, while the rest of the class had their heads buried in books, Miss Jenkins called Jacob over to her desk. Her voice was calm, even friendly, but Jacob stiffened immediately. "Did you see who erased the board?" she asked. Jacob hesitated. He didn't want to lie, but he also didn't want to say what he was thinking. Because in truth, he had seen something. He'd come back into the classroom yesterday after recess to grab his sweatshirt and heard whispers. Someone was in the room. And when he peeked in, he saw Evan, one of the older kids from 5th grade, who sometimes helped teachers run copies or clean up between classes. Evan was standing near the board with an eraser in his hand, looking around nervously. But the second Jacob made a sound, Evan disappeared into the hallway like smoke. Jacob never told anyone, mostly because Evan had warned him in the past. Snitches don't last long in this school. It wasn't a direct threat, but it felt like one. And now, with this board situation, Jacob felt like he was being pulled into something much bigger than just a seating chart. That afternoon, during library time, Emma finally found the courage to say something to Miss Jenkins. Quietly, away from the others, she told her about what she'd seen near the swings last week. The mocking, the laughter, the way Jacob's friends had acted when Lucas was nearby. Miss Jenkins didn't show any emotion on her face as Emma spoke, but her hand gripped the edge of her clipboard just a little tighter. "Thank you for telling me," she said gently, placing a hand on Emma's shoulder. "That takes a lot of courage." But deep down, Miss Jenkins knew this wasn't just playground teasing. It was connected. And now, with a missing board message and the whisper of someone possibly interfering with her class environment, she realized something darker was threading its way into her classroom. Someone didn't want this lesson to reach its conclusion. Then came the strange phone call. Right before dismissal, the school secretary poked her head into the classroom and motioned for Miss Jenkins to come to the office. When she returned a few minutes later, she looked distracted, her eyes clouded with something unspoken. "That was the district office," she told the class in a neutral voice. "Nothing serious, just checking in." But Jacob noticed how her hand trembled slightly when she picked up her coffee. Something was off. And he wasn't the only one who felt it. Emma, sitting 2 rows away, met his eyes just for a second. There was no anger anymore. Just concern. Something bigger than any of them had started to move, and no one was sure where it was going. The final piece of the day came in the form of a folded note left on Jacob's desk after recess. It was written in red ink, no name, just 6 words. "Stop asking questions. Let it go." That was it. No context, no explanation. Just a quiet threat, dropped like a trapdoor under his feet. Jacob stared at it for a long time, wondering who could have written it. Evan? One of the kids in class? Someone else entirely? And most importantly, what did they mean by questions? Jacob hadn't told anyone about Evan near the board. He hadn't even said anything about the text from his dad. But someone knew he was thinking, digging, piecing things together. And they didn't want him to. And that's where everything got a whole lot more complicated. Because what none of the students knew, not Emma, not Lucas, not even Jacob, was that Miss Jenkins had been warned too. That phone call from the district office? It wasn't routine. Someone had lodged a formal complaint about her, accusing her of pushing a political agenda in the classroom. The seating chart, the message on the board, the reading of anonymous confessions. It had all been labeled inappropriate, too emotional, divisive. The complaint hadn't come from a stranger. It came from a parent, one who had very specific views about what kind of kids should be included and what kind shouldn't. Now Miss Jenkins was on notice. One more slip, one more incident, and she'd be facing a formal investigation. That's why the message had been erased. That's why the tension had suddenly spiked. And that's why the next move she made had to be precise, because the wrong one could cost her not just her job, but her ability to protect the students who needed her most. Especially the one who had just received a threatening note. Especially the one who didn't yet know he was about to uncover something that would change how he saw not just Lucas, but his entire family. Because the next piece of this puzzle, the secret buried in the files of the school counselor's office, was about to surface. A record from 2 years ago. A name Jacob had heard before. A betrayal that no one was supposed to remember. And once Jacob saw it, nothing would ever be the same again. It started with a backpack. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place, just a blue and gray bag tucked beneath a chair in the library, one of dozens scattered throughout the room during the late afternoon reading session. But as the last bell rang and students trickled out to catch their buses, Emma noticed something strange. Her own bag had been moved, just slightly, not enough to raise alarm, but enough for someone as detail-oriented as her to catch. She bent down to zip it closed and saw a piece of paper sticking out of the side pocket, one that she hadn't opened all day. At first, she thought it might have been one of her notes or a schedule flyer, but as she pulled it out, her stomach tightened. It wasn't hers. It wasn't signed. And just like the note Jacob had received earlier, it was written in red ink. You think you're helping, but you're not. Stay quiet, or you'll regret it. Her hands trembled as she shoved it deep into her hoodie pocket, eyes flicking around the room to see if anyone had been watching. But the library was nearly empty now, the voices distant, the windows glowing with the late afternoon sun. She didn't tell anyone. Not right away. Something about the wording made her feel exposed, like someone had been watching her closely, following her moves. And worse, if Jacob had received a note, and now she had too, who else was being targeted? Was this connected to Lucas? Or was there another reason someone wanted them to stop asking questions? Meanwhile, Jacob couldn't stop thinking about what Miss Jenkins had said during their brief conversation earlier that day. Her voice had been soft but pointed. Sometimes people erase more than words, Jacob. At the time, it seemed metaphorical, like something meant to encourage him to think deeper. But now, after the note, the disappearance of the board message, and his gut feeling that something bigger was lurking just beneath the surface, he began to wonder if Miss Jenkins was speaking about something real, about people covering tracks, hiding past actions, removing the pieces that didn't fit the narrative. It sent him down a rabbit hole that night, scrolling through old-school newsletters and yearbooks, looking for any connection between Lucas and other students, any hint of controversy that might have involved Evan, or even the parents rumored to be behind the complaint. That's when he saw it. Buried in the notes from a PTA meeting 2 years ago, something that would have been forgettable to most. A line that read, "Concerns raised about inclusive curriculum materials and seating policies implemented by Jenkins." It was subtle, tucked between budget notes and calendar dates, but to Jacob, it was a breadcrumb. That meant this wasn't new. Miss Jenkins had been targeted before for trying to make her classroom more inclusive. And whoever was behind it had power, enough to file complaints, to manipulate how teachers operated, maybe even to make threats without leaving a trace. Things escalated the next day when Lucas didn't show up for school. His desk sat empty. No explanation. No call-out. Miss Jenkins said nothing about it, but her face gave her away. She knew something, and whatever it was, it rattled her. The kids noticed it too. Emma, still shaken by her anonymous note, looked at Jacob across the room and mouthed, "Where is he?" Jacob shrugged, but his pulse quickened. He remembered what Lucas had told him during that long pause by the art wall. Sometimes people try to make you disappear. Not just from the seat next to them, but from everywhere. It had sounded like poetry back then. Now it felt like a warning. Later that afternoon, Miss Jenkins asked Emma and Jacob to stay behind under the pretense of organizing books, but the moment the room cleared out, she shut the door and lowered her voice. "You both need to be careful," she said, scanning the hallway before continuing. Lucas didn't come to school today because his parents were threatened. An anonymous message. No return address. Just a printed letter saying that if they don't remove him from this school, someone will. Emma gasped. Jacob's jaw clenched. He could feel the heat rising behind his eyes. Not just fear now, but anger. Who would do something like that? And why? What did they have to gain by getting Lucas out? Miss Jenkins continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's more. I received an email last night. It didn't come from the district. It was encrypted, masked through a fake school address. It said if I continue interfering with the social balance of my classroom, I'll be reported to the state board." She paused, searching their eyes. Someone is watching, and they want us silent. That night, Jacob couldn't sleep. The questions swirled too fast, too loud. Who had this kind of access? Who was willing to threaten a teacher, a student, even a child's parents just to keep things the way they were? He thought about Evan again, the fifth grader who didn't belong in the room that day, who always seemed to know too much for his age, whose older brother, it turned out, was a former student who had once gotten into trouble for bullying a special needs child. Lucas's older cousin, to be exact. A detail Jacob had uncovered earlier when scanning an old disciplinary report Miss Jenkins had once referenced in a speech. It was all starting to twist together, not in a straight line but like a web. And that's when Jacob found something else, something that made his hands go cold. Hidden inside one of the library's older donation books was a slip of paper, so old and yellowed it almost crumbled when he touched it. It had been tucked deep inside a novel about resilience and overcoming isolation. Ironic, considering what they were dealing with. On it, in the same red ink, were words that sent chills down his spine. This has happened before. And last time, it ended badly. Now Jacob wasn't just afraid. He was sure. This wasn't just about one boy being excluded. This was about history repeating itself. A cycle of silence. And someone was determined to keep the truth buried, even if it meant hurting the people who dared to uncover it. Jacob had always assumed danger was something you saw coming, like the sound of a car horn before a crash, or the rumble of a storm in the distance. But this crept up like a shadow behind him, invisible until it wrapped around his neck. It started the morning after he found the note in the library book. A black car, tinted windows, parked across the street from his house. At first, he thought it belonged to one of the neighbors. But it didn't move, not during breakfast, not during the ride to school. And then again, later that evening, it reappeared, parked in the same spot. Just idling. Lights off. No plates. His dad knocked on the window when he saw it outside, but the engine revved once, and the car sped away without a word. That's when the fear really settled in. Not the kind that makes you jump at loud noises, but the deeper kind. The kind that hums in your bones and makes you look over your shoulder even when you're alone in your room. That night, Jacob barely slept. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the window made his heart race. His mom asked him if he was feeling sick, and for a moment, he thought about telling her everything. The notes, Lucas's disappearance, the web of secrets that had grown bigger and darker with each passing day. But then he remembered what Miss Jenkins had said. If someone's willing to send threats to a teacher, they'll go after anyone. So he stayed quiet, nodded, and forced a smile that felt more like a mask than a real expression. He knew that once he crossed this line, once he shared what he'd uncovered, there was no turning back. And deep down, a part of him feared that whoever was behind this was counting on exactly that, silence. The next day, Emma didn't come to school. No text. No post. Nothing. Jacob checked her location on Snap Map, but her phone was offline. The dread in his stomach twisted tighter. It wasn't like her to disappear without a word. He tried calling her 3 times before lunch, but each time it went straight to voicemail. He approached Miss Jenkins after class, his voice shaky, but she was already ahead of him. "She's not answering me either," she whispered. "I drove by her house this morning. Her car was still in the driveway, but something felt off." She paused, eyes darting toward the door as if she expected someone to be listening. "Jacob, you need to be careful. Whatever we've stumbled into, it's bigger than this school. I think someone is trying to erase the past. And now they're coming for anyone who remembers it." By the time school ended, Jacob was in full survival mode. He avoided the usual route home, looping twice around the block before ducking into the old pedestrian underpass near the park. His breath came in short bursts, heart hammering in his chest as every sound seemed amplified. He was sure he was being followed. He couldn't explain how he knew, but there was a weight behind him. Quiet footsteps, a rustle in the hedges, the slight shuffle of gravel where no one should be. He spun around suddenly, fists clenched, but the path was empty. Still, the sense of being watched didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. When he finally made it home, he locked the door behind him and headed straight to the old file cabinet in the basement. His dad used to keep everything: tax records, school notices, even old newspaper clippings. Jacob dug until his fingers ached, searching for anything connected to the school's past controversies. That's when he found the article. A small local headline from nearly a decade ago: elementary student with disability transferred after bullying incident escalates. No names. No details. Just vague wording, and a black and white photo of the school entrance. But Jacob recognized the date. It matched the time Miss Jenkins had first started teaching there. A chill ran down his spine. What if Lucas wasn't the first student to be pushed out? What if this had been happening for years, and someone had been covering it up all along? As he folded the article and tucked it into his notebook, his phone buzzed. It was a new message, but not from any number he recognized. No name, just a string of digits. He hesitated, then opened it. A single photo. His house. Taken from the street. The timestamp said 2 minutes ago. He raced to the window, but again, no sign of anyone. No black car. No stranger. Just the ordinary stillness of the late afternoon. But everything inside him screamed that nothing was ordinary anymore. He wasn't just unraveling a schoolyard injustice. He was peeling back the layers of something darker, something calculated. And whoever was behind it wanted him to stop. Desperately. He sat on the floor for a long time, trying to breathe, trying to think. His mind raced with images. Lucas crying in the hallway, Emma's empty desk, the note in red ink, the parked car, the article buried in dust. Nothing made sense on its own, but together they painted a picture he couldn't ignore. Someone had power. Enough to remove kids. Enough to silence teachers. Enough to scare families into compliance. And now, that same power had turned its eyes directly on him. The next message came 30 minutes later. A simple sentence. If you keep digging, we'll bury the truth and you with it. Jacob didn't sleep that night, not even a minute. The shadows in his room felt too alive, too deliberate, as if they were watching him instead of simply falling across the walls. Every noise outside his window made him jolt, and every flash of a passing car threw his heart into overdrive. He kept checking his phone, half expecting another threat, another anonymous warning, or worse, a photo of someone he loved. But what he got instead was a message from someone he never expected. At 2:41 a.m., a new number popped up with a name that stopped his breath. Lucas. The same Lucas who was supposed to have moved away. The same Lucas whose parents claimed they needed a fresh start, and whose silence had become the catalyst for everything Jacob had been uncovering. The message was short, just a single line that shattered everything. It wasn't supposed to be you. Jacob stared at the screen for a long time, his hands frozen, mind racing. He replied instantly, asking if it was really him, where he was, what was going on. Minutes passed. No answer. And then, just as he was about to give up, another message arrived. Check the photo again. Look closely. He opened the photo, the one of his house from earlier, and this time he zoomed in, scanning every corner, every pixel. And then he saw it. In the reflection of a car's side mirror, nearly invisible unless you were looking for it, was a face. Not a stranger. Not some hired thug. It was Mr. Alder, the school guidance counselor. The same Mr. Alder who had comforted parents during school board meetings, who always had a calm voice and open door, who had once given Jacob a book on emotional resilience. He had been there, watching, hiding in plain sight. And that changed everything. Suddenly, all the pieces twisted in new directions. Jacob remembered how Mr. Alder had steered him away from talking to certain teachers. How he always seemed to know what students were struggling with before anyone said a word. How he had gently discouraged Jacob from digging into the old school records, saying, "Some stories just don't have happy endings." And now, seeing his face in that mirror, it felt like the final mask had slipped. But the question was, why? Why would someone like him be involved in threats, disappearances, cover-ups? Why would he target Lucas and now him? Unable to stay still any longer, Jacob snuck out of the house before dawn and headed straight to the school. He knew the janitor arrived early, and if he was lucky, he could slip in unnoticed. The hallways felt eerily empty, echoing with the sound of his own footsteps. He made his way to the counselor's office, heart pounding, eyes darting. The door was locked. No surprise. But a half-inch gap at the bottom let him see the faint glow of a computer monitor inside. Someone had been there recently. And on the floor, just barely visible under the door, was a single sheet of paper. He crouched, pulled it through with his fingertips, and stared at the document. It was a student report, but not for anyone in his class. It was for him. Notes, observations, and a chilling phrase circled in red ink. Trigger subject, behavioral testing. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. Behavioral testing? What did that even mean? That's when Miss Jenkins found him. She was out of breath, her face pale, clutching her phone like a lifeline. "Jacob," she whispered, pulling him away from the door. "We need to talk.
Right now."
Somewhere private." They slipped into the empty art room, where the walls were lined with student drawings and the lights flickered with an eerie hum. She pulled out her phone and showed him an old email thread, one she said had been buried in the school's server for years. It was a communication chain between Mr. Alder and someone listed only as Admin Black. The emails discussed a secret initiative, testing student responses to high-stress environments using real-world social triggers, all under the guise of behavioral observation. The phrase that repeated over and over sent a chill down Jacob's spine. Adaptive tolerance thresholds must be monitored at all times. It wasn't bullying. It wasn't random. It was a controlled experiment on students. Lucas hadn't just been targeted for being different. He had been selected, observed,
pushed.
And when his reactions didn't align with the desired outcome, he was removed like a failed subject in a lab. Jacob's confrontation in class, his questions, his resistance, it had made him the next candidate. Everything he thought had been a cruel coincidence was part of a calculated system hidden behind smiling teachers and friendly emails. Even his friendship with Emma, her growing interest in the mystery, might have been part of the data collection. And then Miss Jenkins dropped the real bombshell. "Jacob," she said, her voice shaking, "I didn't tell you everything. I used to be part of the program. Years ago. I was brought in under the promise that it would help us understand trauma in learning environments. But when I realized what they were really doing, I tried to pull out. That's when they started watching me. And now they know you're too close." Jacob's mind reeled. The person he had trusted the most, the only adult who had believed him, had once been on the inside. Maybe she had good intentions. Maybe she really had tried to stop it. But how could he be sure? Could he trust anything now? And what about the others? Was his mom's silence a coincidence? Was Emma's disappearance really about fear? Or was she part of it too? Every thread of certainty unraveled in his hands, and for the first time, he realized the truth might not just be dangerous, it might be designed to destroy anyone who got close. Jacob sat on the bus bench outside the school long after the last bell rang, his fingers gripping the edges of the crumpled paper from Mr. Alder's office. The sky above had begun to dim into that heavy, bruised shade of early evening, and every passing car made his stomach twist. He had come here looking for answers, but what he found instead was a maze of lies wrapped around people he once trusted. Now he faced a question that refused to let go. How deep did this go, and who else was hiding behind a smile? His thoughts were suddenly interrupted by the buzz of his phone. Another message. No name, no profile picture. Just a text. "You want to know everything? Meet me where it started. But come alone." It was accompanied by a dropped pin, an old property near the edge of town, once the site of a shut-down youth facility that had long been swallowed by weeds and whispers. Jacob knew it instantly. His dad had once mentioned it, just briefly, in a conversation that felt like it had slipped out by accident before he quickly changed the subject. That's when the pieces finally collided. Jacob's father. Always distant. Always quick to shut down any talk about his school. Always brushing aside the discomfort around special programs like it was best not to dig too deep. He had just assumed it was because his father had a heavy job, or that he didn't understand the way kids were treated nowadays. But now it made sense. The offhand comments, the files he thought were just boring work documents, the long nights on the phone behind locked office doors. The realization hit Jacob like a sucker punch to the chest. His father wasn't just aware.
He was involved.
Back at home, the air felt thicker than usual, as though even the walls were holding secrets. Jacob found his dad in the kitchen, eating dinner like it was any other Tuesday, the TV humming quietly behind him with some documentary playing. And yet, Jacob couldn't stop staring at him. How many times had he passed this man, eaten across from him, laughed at his dry jokes, not knowing he might have helped orchestrate the worst year of his life. His hands trembled as he pulled the paper from his jacket and tossed it onto the table. His dad barely glanced down before sighing, the weight of 1,000 buried truths pressing down on the room. "I told them to leave you out of it," he said quietly, not looking up. "I warned them this might happen." That single line broke whatever dam Jacob had been holding back. The yelling came fast and loud, his voice cracking with betrayal and disbelief. But his father didn't raise his voice. He didn't deny it. Instead, he admitted that years ago, after the sudden closure of the youth facility, a private organization stepped in to study behavioral outcomes in educational settings. His father had agreed to assist with oversight, convinced that the project would help struggling kids by offering psychological interventions. But over time, the program morphed. Funding changed. The data became more important than the students. The line between help and manipulation blurred until people like Lucas became test subjects and whistleblowers like Miss Jenkins were pushed out. "I thought I was protecting you," his dad said, finally looking him in the eye. "But they saw how curious you were. They saw you wouldn't stop." Jacob stood there, hollowed out by the idea that someone he loved had been sitting on a ticking bomb of moral compromise, and all the while, he had been in the crosshairs. But before he could ask more, before he could demand answers about who was behind it all, his dad leaned in and said something that turned the tension into a noose. "They gave me a choice: protect my family, or stay silent and let them pull you in." Now Jacob was the one faced with an impossible choice. The anonymous message on his phone was still there, glowing like a dare. "Go alone, or stay and live with the weight of knowing you might never uncover the full truth." But now there was another layer, his father's safety, and possibly his mother's too. What would happen if Jacob went? What if he didn't come back? Or worse, what if they decided his dad had said too much and cut their losses? That night, Jacob sat in his room, staring at two objects on his desk: the photo of his house with Mr. Alder's face caught in the reflection, and the location pin that now seemed more like a trap than a clue. He felt pulled in every direction, his conscience screaming to expose the truth, his fear whispering to let it go. And then came a knock at his window. It was Emma. Only she wasn't alone. Behind her, in the shadows of the yard, stood someone Jacob hadn't seen in weeks: Lucas. Jacob couldn't breathe. Not because he was afraid, but because everything he thought he understood had just shattered into something far more terrifying than he was ready for. Emma's knock had been urgent, desperate even, but what broke him was Lucas, alive, standing, eyes wide with fear, and completely changed. His face was thinner, paler, and his hands wouldn't stop shaking. He hadn't just been sent away for some evaluation, like the school claimed. He had been taken, hidden, and now he was back, not because he wanted to be, but because he had escaped. And what he said next made the blood drain from Jacob's face. "It's not just the school," Lucas whispered as they huddled in Jacob's room, the curtains pulled tight. "It's the district. It's the entire program." Jacob tried to make sense of it, but Lucas wouldn't slow down. He talked about surveillance teams, digital profiles, data collection, and how students who didn't fit a productive profile were flagged and monitored. They were labeled as potential liabilities, their interactions recorded, their choices tracked, all under the guise of early behavioral intervention. But what Lucas said next turned a disturbing theory into a nightmare. Some of the kids who were flagged never came back. They weren't suspended. They weren't moved. They were erased. Transferred to special schools that didn't appear on any state record, with staff that weren't licensed and no contact ever made with their families again. Jacob's mind raced back to all the little things he'd ignored: students who had vanished mid-semester with no explanation, teachers who suddenly resigned, office aides who kept whispering about a new protocol. It had all seemed like regular school drama. But now, every hallway memory warped into something darker. Lucas pulled something from his jacket, a flash drive. "Everything's on here.
Logs.
Reports. Even a few videos from the facility. I took them before I got out. But we have to move. They know I'm gone." Jacob barely had time to absorb the weight of it when his phone lit up with another message, but this one didn't come from the anonymous number. It was from someone he knew: Mr. Alder. The same man who'd publicly defended him, who'd warned him to stay out of trouble, who had promised to look into Lucas's disappearance. The message was chilling in its simplicity. They're watching you. You need to come in.
Now.
Alone. Jacob stared at the screen, his stomach twisting. Emma looked over his shoulder, and her face turned to stone. You can't go, she said, but Jacob wasn't sure anymore. Because deep down, part of him still wanted to believe Mr. Alder was one of the good guys, caught in a system he couldn't control, trying to protect the students without blowing his cover. But Lucas shook his head. He's in it. All of them are. They don't let anyone stay unless they're willing to cover for it. That's when Jacob's computer beeped, a motion alert from the front door camera. He clicked it open, and what he saw nearly made his heart stop. A black car, idling just down the street. No plates. No one got out, but he could feel it watching him, hunting him. The decision was no longer about curiosity. It wasn't about proving something. Now it was about survival, and making sure the truth saw daylight before someone made sure he disappeared, too. He turned back to Lucas and Emma. We need to get to someone outside the district, he said. Someone who can leak this. A reporter. A senator. Anyone. But Lucas hesitated. There's one more thing, he said, voice shaking. Someone you're not going to want to believe is part of this, but they are. And they're closer to you than you think. Jacob's heart pounded as Lucas leaned in, whispered a name, and shattered what little trust Jacob had left in the world. It was someone he saw nearly every day. Someone who had helped raise him. And they were the reason Lucas had been taken in the first place. The air inside the gymnasium was heavy, thick with tension, sweat, and the kind of silence that feels like it's waiting to explode. Jacob could feel every eye on him as he stepped through the side door, heart pounding beneath the weight of what he now knew. Rows of folding chairs were filled with parents, teachers, and district administrators who'd been summoned under the guise of a town hall about mental health initiatives in the school system. But Jacob had another plan entirely. He glanced toward Emma in the back, standing next to a reporter she'd quietly tipped off earlier that day. Lucas was hidden in the audio booth above, preparing to play the final piece of evidence they had. Jacob's fingers trembled around the flash drive in his palm, the one that contained it all: video footage, emails, files that traced the conspiracy from the district office all the way up to the school board. But before he could reach the mic, Mr. Alder intercepted him, stepping directly in his path. You don't want to do this, Jacob, he said in a low voice, his usual calm replaced by something desperate. You don't know what you're walking into. You think this is about one school? This goes higher. Much higher. If you expose this, you don't just endanger yourself, you put your family in danger too. And that's when Jacob understood the last piece of the puzzle. It had always felt personal, too targeted, too calculated. The threats, the manipulation, the cover-up. It hadn't just been about Lucas. It was about Jacob too. Because the person who had helped build this system, the one who had quietly pushed the district's behavioral control programs into full operation, was his own uncle, Dr. Charles Enders, the same man who'd funded the school's new early intervention initiative, the same man who had raised Jacob after his mother passed. And he was sitting calmly in the front row, smiling like this was just another school function. Jacob's voice cracked as he stepped up to the mic, gripping it tighter than he meant to. I wasn't going to say anything, he began, eyes scanning the room. I thought maybe if I kept my head down, followed the rules, I could make it through. But then my friend disappeared. And when I tried to ask questions, I was told to stop, to keep quiet, that asking questions was dangerous. There was a murmur in the crowd. Someone shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Alder moved closer, but before he could interfere, the overhead speakers crackled to life. Lucas's voice, clear, trembling, poured out across the room. They told me I was broken, that I needed to be fixed. But what they really meant was that I didn't fit in, that I asked too many questions, that I noticed too much. And then came the video. Footage of the off-the-books correction facility, where students like Lucas had been held in silence, isolated, sedated, observed. There was no medical staff, just hired security. Jacob looked out at the sea of stunned faces as the truth unraveled in real time. Parents gasped. Teachers stared at each other in horror. A district official stood up, shouting over the sound, demanding it be turned off, but it was too late. The truth was out. Dr. Enders didn't move. He simply rose from his chair, adjusted his blazer, and made his way toward the exit. Jacob blocked his path. "Why?" he demanded. "Why them? Why me?" Enders looked at him with a sad, patronizing calm. "Because control prevents chaos. Because society isn't built to accommodate everyone, Jacob. You of all people should understand that." But just as security reached for Jacob to remove him, another twist landed like a lightning bolt. Emma's reporter had gone live, broadcasting the entire event straight to social media. Phones buzzed. Comments flooded in. News outlets started calling. This wasn't something that could be swept under the rug anymore. Dr. Enders turned pale, realizing it was over. But just when Jacob thought it had all come to a head, just when the danger seemed to pass, another message came through on his phone. An encrypted email, and signed, containing names and locations of 3 more facilities. And one final line that chilled him to the core. Lucas wasn't the first.
And he won't be the last.
This isn't over. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with anticipation. The district had finally caved, the weight of public outrage too overwhelming to ignore. The investigation was underway, a full-blown legal battle unfolding in front of Jacob and Emma. But even as the legal team worked tirelessly to hold Dr. Enders and the others accountable, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was far from over. The files, the footage, and the testimonies from students like Lucas had rattled the system, but that wasn't enough. The deeper Jacob dug, the more he realized that what had been exposed wasn't a singular issue. It was a reflection of a broken system that had long been in place, quietly controlling lives, manipulating futures, and erasing people who didn't conform to a dangerous standard of normalcy. Dr. Enders had been arrested, along with a handful of others who were involved, but Jacob knew that many more were still behind the scenes, waiting for the next generation of students to fall through the cracks. The justice they'd fought for felt like a hollow victory at times, knowing that it would take years, perhaps decades, to truly untangle the web of influence and control that had grown too powerful to dismantle overnight. The truth had come out, but as the crowds that once cheered for change started to disperse, Jacob couldn't help but feel like something was still missing. As the days turned into weeks, and the dust settled, Jacob took a step back. He'd spent so long fighting against the system, against the lies, that he hadn't taken the time to process the toll it had taken on him. Emma had been by his side, steady and unwavering, but even she had noticed the quiet exhaustion in his eyes. The emotional weight of the entire ordeal was beginning to sink in, and though the truth had set them free, it had also taken something from them. Lucas was still recovering, the trauma of his experiences far from over, but at least he was free now, starting to rebuild a life outside of the shadow of the facility. He was slowly but surely finding his voice again, and that gave Jacob a flicker of hope amidst the chaos. One evening, as Jacob stood in his room, looking out at the city skyline, Emma joined him, her presence grounding him in ways he hadn't realized he needed. "You did good, Jacob," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of everything they'd been through. "You didn't give up. You didn't let them silence you." He nodded, but the silence between them felt heavy, filled with the things they both knew but hadn't said. He wasn't sure if he'd ever truly be able to shake the image of Dr. Enders, standing in front of him, explaining the system's twisted justification for what they'd done. He wasn't sure if he could ever fully forgive himself for the moments he'd almost lost sight of why he started this fight in the first place. But as he stood there with Emma, watching the stars flicker in the distance, he realized that maybe peace wasn't about having all the answers. Maybe it was about taking one step at a time, knowing that the journey ahead was unpredictable, but not entirely hopeless. Still, just as he was about to turn away from the window, a soft ping from his phone broke the quiet moment. It was an encrypted message, the same kind he had received before. The same unsettling, anonymous tone. The message simply read, "You think you've won, but we're just getting started." Jacob's hand tightened around the phone, his pulse quickening. Emma looked at him, sensing the change. "What is it?" she asked, but Jacob didn't answer. He couldn't. The weight of the message hung in the air, a reminder that for every battle they won, there would always be a new fight waiting. As the screen of his phone went dark, the questions that had driven him forward resurfaced with a vengeance. Had they truly exposed everything? Was Dr. Enders just the first domino to fall? Or was the system they'd uncovered just a small part of something even bigger, even more dangerous than they had ever imagined? The camera pulled back slowly as Jacob stood there, staring at the message, his mind racing with the possibilities. The world outside was changing, but so was he. There were no more answers, no more assurances, just a growing sense that the real fight had only just begun. And no matter how many walls they tore down, there would always be more waiting to be exposed, more hidden truths to uncover. As the screen faded to black, the lingering thought echoed in the silence. Who could they trust when even the people closest to them were a part of the game? And as the final credits rolled, the story wasn't over. It had just begun. Enders looked at him with a sad, patronizing calm. Because control prevents chaos. Because society isn't built to accommodate everyone, Jacob. You of all people should understand that. But just as security reached for Jacob to remove him, another twist landed like a lightning bolt. Emma's reporter had gone live, broadcasting the entire event straight to social media. Phones buzzed. Comments flooded in. News outlets started calling. This wasn't something that could be swept under the rug anymore. Dr. Enders turned pale, realizing it was over. But just when Jacob thought it had all come to a head, just when the danger seemed to pass, another message came through on his phone. An encrypted email, and signed, containing names and locations of 3 more facilities. And one final line that chilled him to the core. Lucas wasn't the first.
And he won't be the last.
This isn't over. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with anticipation. The district had finally caved, the weight of public outrage too overwhelming to ignore. The investigation was underway, a full-blown legal battle unfolding in front of Jacob and Emma. But even as the legal team worked tirelessly to hold Dr. Enders and the others accountable, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was far from over. The files, the footage, and the testimonies from students like Lucas had rattled the system, but that wasn't enough. The deeper Jacob dug, the more he realized that what had been exposed wasn't a singular issue. It was a reflection of a broken system that had long been in place, quietly controlling lives, manipulating futures, and erasing people who didn't conform to a dangerous standard of normalcy. Dr. Enders had been arrested, along with a handful of others who were involved, but Jacob knew that many more were still behind the scenes, waiting for the next generation of students to fall through the cracks. The justice they'd fought for felt like a hollow victory at times, knowing that it would take years, perhaps decades, to truly untangle the web of influence and control that had grown too powerful to dismantle overnight. The truth had come out, but as the crowds that once cheered for change started to disperse, Jacob couldn't help but feel like something was still missing. As the days turned into weeks, and the dust settled, Jacob took a step back. He'd spent so long fighting against the system, against the lies, that he hadn't taken the time to process the toll it had taken on him. Emma had been by his side, steady and unwavering, but even she had noticed the quiet exhaustion in his eyes. The emotional weight of the entire ordeal was beginning to sink in, and though the truth had set them free, it had also taken something from them. Lucas was still recovering, the trauma of his experiences far from over, but at least he was free now, starting to rebuild a life outside of the shadow of the facility. He was slowly but surely finding his voice again, and that gave Jacob a flicker of hope amidst the chaos. One evening, as Jacob stood in his room, looking out at the city skyline, Emma joined him, her presence grounding him in ways he hadn't realized he needed. "You did good, Jacob," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of everything they'd been through. "You didn't give up. You didn't let them silence you." He nodded, but the silence between them felt heavy, filled with the things they both knew but hadn't said. He wasn't sure if he'd ever truly be able to shake the image of Dr. Enders, standing in front of him, explaining the system's twisted justification for what they'd done. He wasn't sure if he could ever fully forgive himself for the moments he'd almost lost sight of why he started this fight in the first place. But as he stood there with Emma, watching the stars flicker in the distance, he realized that maybe peace wasn't about having all the answers. Maybe it was about taking one step at a time, knowing that the journey ahead was unpredictable, but not entirely hopeless. Still, just as he was about to turn away from the window, a soft ping from his phone broke the quiet moment. It was an encrypted message, the same kind he had received before. The same unsettling, anonymous tone. The message simply read, "You think you've won, but we're just getting started." Jacob's hand tightened around the phone, his pulse quickening. Emma looked at him, sensing the change. "What is it?" she asked, but Jacob didn't answer. He couldn't. The weight of the message hung in the air, a reminder that for every battle they won, there would always be a new fight waiting. As the screen of his phone went dark, the questions that had driven him forward resurfaced with a vengeance. Had they truly exposed everything? Was Dr. Enders just the first domino to fall? Or was the system they'd uncovered just a small part of something even bigger, even more dangerous than they had ever imagined? The camera pulled back slowly as Jacob stood there, staring at the message, his mind racing with the possibilities. The world outside was changing, but so was he. There were no more answers, no more assurances, just a growing sense that the real fight had only just begun. And no matter how many walls they tore down, there would always be more waiting to be exposed, more hidden truths to uncover. As the screen faded to black, the lingering thought echoed in the silence. Who could they trust when even the people closest to them were a part of the game? And as the final credits rolled, the story wasn't over. It had just begun.